First, I would like to thank all my colleagues, some of them are listed here, who contributed to this work. This was a truly collaborative effort and great team effort, and I would like to thank everybody for the contributions, and it's an honor for me to present this work here today, also on behalf of Betty, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. If you're thinking about health, animal and public health, that is being increasingly connected both at the local, regional and global level, and not only the health of the people and the animals, but also the environment we live in. And that creates new challenges for surveillance on a daily basis. And as Laszlo has said before, the list of diseases is getting longer by the day. That creates a lot of challenges for our surveillance systems, and the decision-making context for this surveillance is heavily influenced by the political economy, and boundaries are set by the cultural and economic context, which shapes how our food systems, what our food systems look like, and also the environment, and also has an influence on how people behave and take decisions. This creates dynamic systems where we see large-scale changes in, for example, consumption patterns and consumer demand, which is largely driven by economic growth. This then in turn has an impact on how we keep animals, the number of animals we keep and the species we keep, and also the type of housing, the feed and so on. In turn, that impacts our trade patterns and also has a massive influence on the whole infrastructure that we use to serve these systems. We then asked ourselves, are modern surveillance systems capturing these dynamics? How are decisions made to allocate resources to surveillance? And what are current animal health surveillance patterns? So we then wanted to characterize the context within which the development of animal health surveillance and evaluation frameworks and tools occurs by describing existing public and private surveillance systems, and also having a look at the animal populations, trade flows, and critical infrastructure that is in place to serve these systems, and then also how decisions about the allocation of resources to animal health surveillance are currently made, with the aim to explore gaps and opportunities for improvements in surveillance. We collected data in 13 European countries, and you can see here the countries where we collected data, all in orange. We used scientific literature sources, internet pages, government reports, and national statistics. We also used the EU trade control and expert system and data from Eurostat, and conducted interviews with decision makers in 7 countries. The aim was to collect surveillance data on all public and private systems, surveillance systems, for all types of threats and all types and animal species. So we didn't have any restrictions at all. We said, go out there and collate everything on any type of surveillance that you can find. And all these data were then entered into a database, and we did consistency checks to make sure that there was not too much heterogeneity in the data set. In terms of population and economic data, we collated data on livestock and bee holdings in Europe, and data on human and animal populations, and also some economic data on GDP and farm values. And now I'm going to present a few selected results. We had a lot of data points, and you will hear a little bit more about some of these in the next talk. And I'm just going to present a few selected items. We had 793 active and enhanced passive surveillance system components recorded. And the main purposes of these components were early detection and warning, which was clearly purpose number 1, followed by to detect cases to allow specific action to be taken to facilitate control or eradication. And the third purpose was to surveillance to substantiate freedom from disease or infection. When we looked at the species, the most frequently targeted one was cattle, followed by pigs, and the third one was poultry. All the other species were of less importance. Looking at the pathogens, we saw that the most frequently recorded one was Salmonella, which was listed in 16% of all the components recorded. Brucellosis was the second one with 10%, and then avian influenza. And also frequently mentioned were classical swine fever, bovine tuberculosis, and BSE. And all the other pathogens, there were many more. They were recorded 2% or less. Then we found that there are different surveillance approaches for different objectives or threat type. So for example, we saw that active surveillance is frequently used for foodborne threats, whereas we see enhanced passive surveillance more often used for early detection. Then wildlife centers, for example, were quite popular for vector-borne diseases, and surveys were often used for production diseases and to substantiate disease freedom. So this is just some preliminary analysis, and we need to do further analysis to see whether these sampling points or approaches used for these specific threats are the most appropriate, and that will then give input into the evaluation, into the surveillance design framework, and you will hear more about this design framework in the later today. Then another component or another aspect that we were very much interested in were surveillance expenditures, with the idea that we wanted to know how are resources allocated to surveillance. Are there certain surveillance objectives or species that are targeted more frequently or get a higher share of the expenditures? And unfortunately, we weren't able to say anything about that. So here you see the total number of components recorded and how many components came with an expenditure estimate for all the 13 countries. And in total, only 23% of all the surveillance components that were recorded in our database came with an expenditure estimate. So it was not possible to say how the resources are allocated to surveillance. However, what we could say was whether it's publicly or privately funded. And what we saw was that almost 60% of the surveillance components were fully publicly funded, and almost 30% were fully privately funded. And then we had some combination of 50-50% funding, some predominantly public and some predominantly private funding. But as you can see, mostly either publicly funded or fully privately funded. When we asked the decision makers about which decision criteria they are using to take decisions on surveillance, the two top criteria were there is an international legal requirement or there is a national legal requirement. And in terms of other criteria often mentioned, we found that cost-benefit measure, cost-effectiveness measure, or expected cost was also something that was frequently mentioned. Also, the disease situation in the country and some impact-related criteria was also quite important in terms of taking decisions for surveillance. Another thing that we found was that there is a very wide range of different private-public partnerships in place. So we see countries where we have 50-50% sharing of everything, cost sharing, responsibility sharing, and it's a fully established formal partnership. And in other countries, we see, for example, that a part of the surveillance is done by private actors, for example, farmers paying for the sample taking or being involved in the sample taking, but the responsibility may be with a public organization. So here we see a lot of different partnerships and possibilities to conduct surveillance. What decision makers also said that they would like to have a lot of other information. That was a question in the end of the interview: what further information would you like to have, or is there further information you would like to have to be able to take appropriate decisions about your surveillance systems? And they mentioned pretty much everything you can think of, but what was very often mentioned was further epidemiological and economic information. So this shows us that there is some discrepancy between what we see in terms of surveillance expenditures and the use in decision making. So decision makers said cost-benefit criteria or economic criteria are quite important, but there was limited information available on the expenditures that we could access or that is publicly available. So we're not quite sure what the reason is for this discrepancy, whether the information is there and it's simply not accessible, or whether the information is not there but people would like to use it, or they use cost-benefit thinking without having hard data. Then when it comes to private and public surveillance information, there is a question, is this information treated as a private or a public good, respectively? When you think about public surveillance, it's usually the information is usually publicly available, accessible for anybody to see, whereas often in private surveillance, this is not generally public information, so it's more treated like a private good. This may be different where we have very strong private-public partnerships where the information is shared and exchanged. So there may be some information sharing asymmetry, which may have implications for the way we allocate resources and shape our systems. And another important consideration is to think about the fixed costs in the system. Very often we need to have quite strong laboratory capacity, which causes a large fixed cost. And the question is, should this cost be borne by the private sector or by the public sector, and how can we make sure that the capacity will be there for the future and for future disease emergency events? In terms of opportunities for improvement in surveillance, I think the major gap that we identified was that there is very little use of systems information in these surveillance components. So we could use, for example, economic data or production data such as milk yield or feed use or water use in these production systems, or even trade networks to inform our surveillance systems. If you think, for example, about the horsemeat scandal, where we had a company in eastern France that ordered from another French company, which then bought meat from a Cypriot trader, who then contracted to another trader in the Netherlands, who then brought from a Romanian butcher and abattoir to be processed in Luxembourg and finally supplied to 16 European countries. The question is, can we capture that? Are our surveillance systems ready for complex trade mechanisms like that or not? And what could we do about that? So as another activity, we had a look at livestock trade networks for guiding animal health surveillance. And we used traces data for live animal movements of the major animal species. And here you just see a few examples for beef, poultry, and equine. We had a look at trade networks for breeding, fattening, and slaughter, and two are here displayed. We see it for breeding and for slaughter. And what I would like to show here is that we can see that our breeding networks are much more connected than our slaughter networks, which probably is related to having smaller consignments and many more of them. And slaughter consignments will usually be much bigger and there will be fewer. So we already see a difference in the purpose and the connectivity in the network because of the breeding or slaughter purpose. And then if you have a look at where the countries are placed, so here we see out degree and in degree, which is exports and imports. And we see some countries like number 10 up here that have very high imports and very high exports for breeding. And that's true for all the species. And then other countries, they have very little import and very little export and some in between. And here for the slaughter, we see, for example, that we have one country, number 14, which is importing a lot. So this gives a very, very clear picture. And that this is something that could be monitored over time to see how the shape of these networks changes. So if, for example, here, instead of country 14, country 7 moves to this position, we would know that something is going on that we may need to have a look at and include in our surveillance system. So that will be an opportunity to have a look at trade networks. And just to emphasize once again why that is important, I would like to present some work that has been done by Guillaume Fournier, and it has been presented last week at the One Health Congress in the Netherlands. He did a cross-border animal trade network analysis using FAO stat data from 1986 to 2011, looking at live animals and meat from cattle, pigs, and poultry. And he found that there is a very high connectivity in these trade networks. And he also saw that they are very highly heterogeneous, and that 80% of the imports and exports are done by less than 20% of all the countries. He also saw that over this rather large time period, the structural feature of the networks were quite stable. And I think the most important point that he made was that we see an increasing network vulnerability to infectious agent transmission. So here you see the variation in the probability of transmission required to reach a given epidemic size over time from 1985 to 2010. And so we see that the transmission probability of an infectious pathogen in the late 80s was close to 1, and it's now being drastically reduced. So that means that these networks are much more vulnerable and that the transmission probability needs to be much lower for an epidemic to occur in these networks. It's probably not a surprise to most people here that this increasing global trade has an impact on potential disease transmission, but this shows very clearly that something is happening and we need to balance that. And one way to balance that would be to have better biosecurity and surveillance systems that take into account these dynamics. And just to wrap up, that's what I said. I think we should use systems data to inform surveillance. It is an opportunity to improve surveillance. And that could help us to move from chasing to a situation of predicting, and help us to be better prepared for emerging events. Then we also saw that surveillance approaches vary with surveillance objective or the threat type, and we still need to do further analysis to find out what is the optimal solution for a given objective or threat that could then help us to inform our design framework. Then there were also a couple of issues about data availability and access and confidentiality, and we will hear more about that in the next talk. And with that, I would like to conclude and thank you for your attention.